right, guys, welcome to your next lecture. This week we are starting Unit 4. This is going to be our critical period, implementing the Constitution period, all about the time leading up to the Constitution and the first big chunk of the beginning of our nation. Your schedule for this week is as follows. This is posted in Teams as well. So you have to watch Lecture 3, Part 1, which is the video that you're listening to right now. You have a few readings for this week. Remember, the readings with the number and then the letter are the readings that come from ushistory.org, and the two readings with the titles there are the PDF readings. Wednesday, we have our online class. Thursday, there is an activity for you to do, which is reading about the Constitution as a counter-revolution, and there are some questions that go along with that. Feel free to answer the questions on a separate document, paper, if you want to submit a Word document or a PDF file. Either of those work. And notice on Friday you have a work day. That work day can be used to complete any of the assignments that you need to for the week. The readings, the lecture, hopefully you have that done first, the counter-revolution activity, or if you finish everything a little early and follow the weekly schedule, there is an extra credit option that you can do. It is titled Breaking Down the Constitution, and if you submit that, I will add on extra points to the test that you just took. So if you are not happy with that score, I will add on 5 points to that test for completing the extra credit option that is listed there. You could find that in Teams. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, we are going to go through 3 sections today. So it might seem like we have a little bit going on here, but the first section is the Declaration of Independence and some post-revolution feelings. So we're looking at how did we take the ideas of the Declaration and implement those into action. So we have the Declaration of Independence. You guys read a little bit of this from last week, and when you were reading, I hope that you could pick apart the 3 main parts of the Declaration. We first have a statement of intent. This is the colonies saying, okay, we are breaking away, we are declaring independence. Then it was followed by that list of grievances telling the king everything that he had done wrong in the eyes of the colonists, and ending with that third part of dissolving ties. This is not the Constitution. I need you to be able to draw that distinct difference between the Declaration and the Constitution. Not only do they happen quite a bit of time away from each other, but they're not the same document. The Declaration is pointing out the problems of the colonists under the king, where the Constitution is creating a new government based on some of the ideas that we saw, some of the issues that we had as colonists. What is in the Declaration are some Enlightenment theories, ideas such as the social contract theory, where we are looking at people have a social contract with their government. That's just kind of the way that life works. We as citizens acknowledge that there has to be a government that exists. And for that government to exist, we have to surrender some power to that government over us. If we don't allow for the government to have that power over us, then the government cannot govern. So there is a social contract between the people and their government. And that theory is very present in the Declaration. They're saying, yes, the government is there to have power over the people, but when that social contract is broken and the government abuses that power, that's when that turn happens and the people have the right to overthrow their government. Now, the idea of natural rights is also in there. The rights of man is addressed in there, and these these people writing the Declaration, when we have Jefferson actually sitting down and bringing all of these ideas together to write the Declaration, they're very well read. These guys are studying what's happening at the time, and they study other countries, they study other governments, they study the Enlightenment philosophers, and they're bringing all of these ideas together to write the Declaration. The Declaration is a legal document, okay, and it does have a practicality appeal where it is just stating that, all men are created equal. This is how we feel. This is how we've been wronged. It's not overly emotional where the colonists could have gone kind of off the rails, but they wanted to be very direct, very to the point, because you've got to think the colonists want to be taken seriously when they're writing the Declaration. If they had gone for that emotional kind of disruptor commentary in the Declaration, they wouldn't have been taken seriously. So there's a practicality appeal there when they're writing. The ideals of the revolution are also addressed. Which is going to inspire revolution around the world. When we see how successful the steps of the colonists towards the revolution were, there is an inspiration of, okay, the colonists under the British Empire can successfully declare independence. Why can't we? Now, the ideal of equality that's in there, all men created equal, while we read it now and can kind of decipher that there's a few different meanings, really back then there was only one. And what they were talking about is all men, all white men in the colonies that were wealthy, landowning, contributors to society were created equal to those over in England. They weren't talking about we all stand together and look at each other as equals, devoid of gender, devoid of race. That's not what they were talking about. Remember, the colonists wanted to be treated the same as those over in England. So when they say all men are created equal, they're trying to drive home the point that we haven't been being treated equally. We demand to be treated equally, and therefore this is going to happen. But it does inspire some ideas of equality within the colonies. You're going to have an anti slavery movement pop up. People will realize the absolute hypocrisy of trying to declare independence from an oppressive leader and then looking within the colonies where a big portion of the economy was dependent on being an oppressive person, an oppressive owner over slaves. And some people will recognize that, okay, we're fighting for independence, but we're going to keep people in this institution. So the anti-slavery movement does have some dustings up here. We'll also start thinking about equality among genders. Remember the Abigail Adams comment to her husband, remember the ladies. What she's saying to him, and a part of that quote is, don't put all the power in the hands of the husbands. It shouldn't be unlimited. That's how our ancestors have done it. Don't forget the women, where we have this opportunity to look at this creation of a new country, and we really should take that opportunity and be revolutionary, include women. And we know that that's not what happens, but the idea is there. Also, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are those natural rights that I'm talking about. The natural rights actually were life, liberty, and property, but they are changed in the Constitution to be pursuit of happiness. I don't want you guys to think that everything was just hunky dory as the revolution happened. Everybody was on the same side. We did talk a little bit in the last lecture that there were a large number of colonists that were not ready for the revolution. You did have your patriots that were ready to fight, but you also had people who just were not willing to put their life on the line for something that may not be successful. And there are a group of loyalists, a large group of loyalists within the colonies, and The Quakers of Pennsylvania will belong to that list. And the people who remained loyal to the crown were just tortured by the Patriots. The Loyalists, some of the torture that they experienced was tar and feathering. Now, tar and feathering wouldn't kill someone, it was meant to be an extreme form of torture and a way of embarrassing. The tar would be your torture, the feathers to throw them on there would be the embarrassing part of it. This happened not only to loyalists but the tax collectors that were also employed by the crown, which would make them loyalists. Um, you're going to see, and this is very interesting, African Americans fight on the side of the British Army. Now, I don't want you to think that African Americans were fighting for the crown. They're not. They're fighting for that same idea that I just said, that it's very hypocritical to have this group of patriots fighting for independence, fighting for their freedoms, only to keep a large portion of the people within the colonies in the institution of slavery. Um, think back just for a second. Crispus Attucks was the first person killed at the Boston Massacre. He was an African American man in the North, where you did not see the heavy presence of slavery, mainly because their economy wasn't completely dependent on it. So Crispus Attucks was an African American man, the first death of this conflict, and that's the first death we know of in this long conflict over the question of colonial independence. Abolitionists are going to um, be a part of the community, but more people of African descent fight on the side of the British Army. And it's likely that the reason for this was that many of the enslaved people's repression would come to fruition post revolution. Slavery would get worse. So, unlike other loyalists, a large segment of those who fought for the British were fighting to push back against the institution of slavery, knowing that after the revolution, which actually happens, they would remain and face the wrath of the victorious American rebels who were dependent on slavery. So just know that that happened. After the revolution, the loyalists, you're going to see some of them escape to other parts of the world, going back to England. There will be a group of slaves that had fought for the British that are taken out of the country. But loyalists were told, don't come home. You want to stay loyal to the crown? Well, have a nice life outside of here. So that's kind of the evil side of the Patriots. They weren't really as loving and accepting of everybody whose ideas were not exactly pigeonholed to what they believed. Post revolution, things aren't going to be all hunky dory when it comes to the status of our relationship with England. England, after the revolution, is going to leave forts on our land, which creates problems for us. The British were supposed to remain neutral. They did not follow up on that. They're going to seize American ships. They are going to push the Native Americans to kind of continue conflict with us. And because of this, you're going to see Washington push for the Jay Treaty. Now, this is going to happen in 1794, so it's kind of a fast forward here. But the Jay Treaty is going to solve those problems, hopefully. It wasn't well in favor with many of the representatives in our then government because it was lenient with England. We had to be lenient under the Jay Treaty and not kind of push for punishment to the full extent against England because we didn't really have anything to back us up at that point. But the Jay Treaty will be signed to prevent the British from seizing our ships, from pushing the Native Americans to fight with us. It's going to be written and negotiated by Supreme Court Chief Justice, a Washington appointee, John Jay, who it's named for. And we're also going to see the idea of the status of slavery. What the heck do we do post-revolution with the status of slavery? The institution of slavery literally fights the idea of equality. We just wrote a document. We are basing our country on the fact that everybody is created equal except slaves. And that issue, I don't want you to think that it just pops up with the Civil War, because it does not. It is there in the roots of our country. It just often is not as studied in history. The status of women, you're going to see women aren't always as quiet as history likes to mention that they are. Judith Sargent Murray is going to write an essay called "On the Equality of Sexes," and this is an essay written in 1790 that says the order of nature demanded full equality of men and women, but male domination corrupted that principle over time. So there are women who are saying we should be treated equal, but it's not going to be until 1920 that they even get the right to vote. Those seeds are planted post-revolution. It just takes years and decades to come to full fruition. Also contributing to that idea that women should be equal, Republican mothers who were educated women who then educated their sons to be more productive members of society had propped up the revolution and pushed forward in the future with creating, raising sons who would go on to lead this great nation. So women are playing an active role in politics, in the building of this nation. It's just kind of behind the scenes because they couldn't be elected. They couldn't go out and, represent their people, their voice. But they are there. Relations with the Native Americans, not that great. The Native Americans are going to fight on the side of the British because they believe that the British could contain the colonists from spreading further into their territory. But when the victory over the British is there, it's also seen as a victory over the Native Americans. The land that was given to Americans that was west of the Appalachian Mountains goes all the way to the Mississippi River, is still inhabited by Native Americans, but you're going to see the colonists pushing out into that land. So relations with the Native Americans, still again, we're pushing them because we believe that that land, as you can see in the map, the all purple, was awarded to us. It's ours. We should get to move out there. But we do that at the expense, again, of taking land. In society, we are going to have what are known as yeomen, which is a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate, these small farms, and artisans, the manufacturers. That's what's going to be kind of the picture of what our society is. When the laws are formed, when the government is created, it is for that group of people. It is not for all men, all women, everyone within our society. When we look at the post-revolution time period as well, we have to think about the forms of government that were up and running up until this point where we declare independence and become the United States of America. The only forms of government we really do were those under the colonies, which were those self-representative forms of government. And during the Revolution, all we saw was the Continental Congress, the committees of correspondence, the Stamp Act Congress, where we had those delegates from the 13 states coming. But we didn't really know what else to base our ideas off on. So we have to form a government that's under popular rule because we know that that's the only thing that people want. That's the only thing that's going to work. And we put a heavy emphasis on the states because we just broke away from one oppressive leader that was separated from the people. We don't want that happening again. And in our government, the state governments are the closest line to the people, and that's what we want. That's what we fought for. So looking forward, the questions we have to answer are: how do we organize? What should the role of the people be? And the state's answer is going to be found in their separate state constitutions. Now, just to take a look at some of the constitutions that were happening at this point, we have the Pennsylvania Constitution, which was put into place in 1776. Some things that you can find there is that there was no property requirements for voting or for office, which was very unique for the time. There is a unicameral government. That means there's only one legislative body. There is no government, or no governor, I should say, sorry. The no governor was a backlash because they thought a governor would be a small scale king, and they didn't want that. The reason they had a unicameral legislature is because they believed that an upper house would only represent the wealthy and the aristocracy. Another state government, the South Carolina state government, did have a property requirement to vote. They said that in fact, the more land you had, you then could run for office. So you had to have more land, which in that state is talking about the plantation owners. Uh, Only those with financial independence could be relied upon because they believed that poor men, women, children, African Americans were seen as dependent, and they were seen as too dependent to actually exercise their right to vote. So in South Carolina, where you see a heavy presence of plantation owners, you're favoring the land requirement and you're favoring the wealthy. Another one is the Maryland State Constitution, which was put into place in 1780. Here you have a government that presented a constitution but was vetoed by the people because the people stated that the government could create and change the constitution and take away the rights of the people, and they were terrified of that. Instead, they specially elected representatives who created a framework for the states, and the process was important to the creation of the Constitution, our later Constitution for all of the government in 1787 to 1788. So you see one state that did not put an emphasis on land requirement in Pennsylvania, in fact, wanted to hear from the average common person. Then you have a state like South Carolina that heavily depended on the land requirement, and you have a state like Maryland who couldn't get it together enough to put a constitution together because the people were afraid of a government. But what we need to do looking forward is to work with popular sovereignty. Remember, that is the people giving rights to the government to lead the majority. And there is going to be a heavy focus on assemblies, not really choosing one all powerful leader to lead, but instead having many representatives who will push forward. The second section, we are going to take a look at the Articles of Confederation, look at some of the successes, look at some of the failures. Maybe this will sound familiar if you had me last year and we talked about the Articles. The Articles of Confederation are going to be drafted by the Continental Congress in 1777, so fresh off our victory in the American Revolution. It is going to be the first national constitution. Look at that constitution, it has a little c. The little c constitution means form of government. So this is our first form of government. Confederation in the Articles of Confederation is a word that stands for grouping of states, alliance of states, allegiance of states. So these articles, which is like a compilation of writings for a group of states, is what the Articles of Confederation stands for. Under the Articles, we're going to see Congress have all of the control. State power is the focus. And when we look at state power, we are saying one state, one vote. And we must have state sovereignty. So where you see popular sovereignty is the people controlling or giving the power to the government. State sovereignty is the focus of the Articles of Confederation. Okay, under the Articles, we are going to see the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to try to answer the question of how do we survey the Western lands, because under the peace treaty with the British after the Revolution, we gain the Northwest Territory. Okay, that is now ours. But we have to figure out, what does that look like? How do we turn it into states? We're going to look at two methods of doing this. We're going to look at the New England blocks, which is a method of blocking off settlements and selling them as a block. Or we could go with the Southern meets and bounds. And this is where in the South they allowed land buyers to choose natural land markers to set the boundaries for their land. The problem with this is natural landmarks change over time. So we have two methods. One, you mark off these blocks kind of in rigid squares, or you can use land markers. But what we are looking for is to provide a process to organize land surveys. Uh, the way that this works, let's just break down what they actually do decide on. We kind of go with the New England blocks theory, because we are dividing the land into squares measuring 6 by 6 miles and calling these squares townships. The townships are going to be split into 36 sections of 1 square mile. Within that 1 square mile is 640 acres, and we're going to number those townships 1 to 36. The acreage in each township can be sold, and the money would be used to build and maintain a school. We're looking at just section 16 there. So they're saying, okay, within one of these townships, we can sell that land off and we can use it to kind of put some education out there. What they do is the land ordinance sets a minimum amount of how much each section can account for. Remember, each section has 640 acres in it. So the price then becomes for one section $640, which breaks down to $1 an acre. At this time, I know today that would be a dream if you could buy an acre for $1. But at the time, the people are going to look at this price set up by the land ordinance and say, that's too much. That's going to favor the wealthy. And you're going to see people taking advantage of this. You'll have land speculators who go out and buy one of those sections and then resell the land for more money. And that's going to hurt the average citizen who wants to purchase land out there, because the land speculators who have all the money are going to go buy up these acres and then sell it for more, which they can't. The average person couldn't afford it at $1. They're not going to be able to afford it for more than that. And there's going to be some downfalls of trying to organize this territory out there, because people are going to fear the threat of Native Americans, and they would kind of stay away because of that threat until the 1790s, when we see more military actions and treaties made with the Native Americans that would subdue that threat. But this is a good plan, and this is going to be a plan that's used to survey the land all the way to the Pacific Ocean as we move forward. So this is huge. This is a success under the Articles of Confederation. Thomas Hutchinson is going to be the first U.S. geographer. He starts in 1785 with the land ordinance. He was supposed to have 13 surveyors, one from each state, come with him to survey the land. Only 4 show up. But so he goes out there with 4 other geographers, and they start surveying the land. They run into Native Americans who were supposed to be planning this attack, so not all hunky-dory as they're going out there, but they use this ordinance to help them survey the land. Now, the other thing that the Articles of Confederation does right is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This is a policy for adding new states to the Union. Jefferson, this is his proposal from 1784. What it says is we can turn territories into states. He proposes this idea because there are 10 Northwest territories that could choose to become a state, and we need more states because we want to expand as a nation. So we're looking to these Western territories. And what the Northwest Ordinance does is it sets up steps for a state or for a territory to become a state. Jefferson really wanted to push for maintaining the civil liberties that were fought for under the Revolution into these new states. He wanted to push for public education. And this is a success. Under the Northwest Ordinance, there is no slavery in these new states. Uh, we are going to see each of the territories out in the Northwest Territory appoint a governor and a council. Once the population reaches 5,000 residents, they could elect an assembly, but there would be a governor that still remained to have absolute veto power. The key here is that once there were 60,000 settlers in the territory, they could draft a constitution and petition for statehood. We are going to use this under the Constitution. This is another success that we keep from the Articles because it's just such a good plan. The roadmap for becoming a state, and we wanted more states. We wanted new states so that we could have a growing nation. When we look at successes under the Articles, we are going to see that Congress can conduct foreign relations. Foreign relations at this time really was with the Native Americans, not much beyond that. They could maintain an army and a navy. They won't have the money to do so, but they can do it. They can also coin money, and they will manage Native American affairs, but Congress is going to need state approval for any actions that they want to take. Amending the Articles is going to take all 13 states' approval. States are going to have to work together and respect each other's regulations if they want the Articles to work, which doesn't really happen, but we'll talk about that in a second. The specific matters that Congress can deal with are war, treaties, and regulating money, but they're going to require 9 of the 13 states to vote to pass laws that have anything to do with those categories. So it kind of ties one hand behind Congress's back to be successful. The failures of the article. I love this political cartoon of the rough sailing ahead for the Articles because it's just such a perfect depiction of how terrible the Articles were. It limits power of Congress way too much. It's taking that idea of a limited government to the extreme because we feared a central authority. We did not want a king, so we have no central authority. Without that, we can't settle disputes between the states. So if the states get into an argument, well, that's it. Have fun. Fight it out. Because there is no setup on how we stop those arguments or how we come to a resolution. The central government also had no power to tax, and this is the biggest one. They could only request it from the states. And like I say all the time when we go over the Articles, if I said you can give me $1 every week, only when you feel like it, would there ever be weeks where you feel like giving me $1? Probably not. One of the biggest failures is that there was a need for unanimous decisions when it came to those big decisions of the nation, and getting 13 out of 13 states to agree on anything wasn't going to help. There was no regulation of commerce, which is trade, so you would see states taxing heavily goods from other states. So instead of working together as a nation, we were kind of working against each other because every state wanted to make the most money. They didn't want their people going to another state and buying goods or importing goods from other states, which isn't the reason that we fought the revolution in the first place. We didn't fight it to be fragmented, but the articles and our fear of a centralized power really pushed us into that direction. Shays' Rebellion is going to illustrate the the weaknesses of the articles in a big way. During the revolution, you're going to see many farmers, I should just say, go and fight during the revolution. So they neglect their duties when they're fighting in the revolution, and when they come back, their lives are in shambles. Some of their farms had been stolen when they left during the war. They weren't there to control what was happening. So they don't come home to a hunky-dory happy welcome committee. They come home to find their livelihood in ruins. So there's going to be a class fight that begins when the government starts to relax some of the debtors' laws, but it's only going to be between those who were to be paid by the debtors and the debtors themselves. So it wasn't that they were saying, okay, there's no more debt anymore. They just said, okay, we understand that you're coming back to terrible conditions. Why don't we relax these laws for a little bit? Now, if you know anything, you never relax the rules. If you babysit, you don't go in one night saying that you're tired and they can eat sugar all night, because it's going to result in nothing good. And then every time you babysit, they're going to want sugar, and every time is going to be miserable. That's exactly what happens when the government relaxes these debtor laws, because the states are going to come together, and Massachusetts in particular, and recognize that there is a significant war debt that needs to be paid. And Massachusetts is going to vote to pay off the debt in 3 years between 1783 and 1786, which rose their taxes 60%. And that is going to anger the people who couldn't pay their property anything in the first place. So when the taxes get raised, the farmers are going to have their property seized or taken away, and that is going to lay the groundwork for a rebellion. Daniel Shay is going to be a Revolutionary War veteran whose land had been stolen. He's going to have a lot of farmers around him with the same complaints. The courts that were trying these debts had been threatened and closed because of the seeds of a rebellion coming up, and the rebels are going to easily defeat the state militia. And is uh, that is going to be very terrifying when a group of farmers, and you got to think these are Revolutionary War veterans, easily overthrow a state militia because they weren't putting money into the militia. They didn't have the backing of a federal government to train and supply any of these militias. So when it's easily put down by the rebels and they vote to replace the legislatures or make the legislatures enact debt relief, that shows some pretty significant problems. That this group of ragtag farmers can easily attack courthouses and representatives. So what we see under Shays' Rebellion, it makes clear the weaknesses under the Articles. It shows that we are headed for a national bankruptcy. It shows that there are conflicts among states on trading. It shows that the British refusal to leave is undermining our independence. It shows that the Spanish on the Western Front is a threat, and it shows that we need a stronger leader. When we look at the critical period, this is going to be the time after the Revolutionary War. The goal during this time was to create political stability, but what we really do find is an economic crisis. There's a threat of a military coup because the people are unhappy. From 1784 to 1785, an economic depression is going to strike the nation, which causes the states to raise taxes on other state goods. The states start issuing money that's absolutely worthless. There's a loss of slaves in the South because there's no control. There's a lack of protection for our ships, so our American ships are being taken, and the men on those ships are being sold into slavery. We can't push the British to leave their posts in the Northwest Territory. Spain refuses to recognize us as a state or as a nation, and they refuse to trade with us. They try to take land from us, and the states start to go rogue. But the final straw that breaks the camel's back is Shays' Rebellion, and that calls for a time of change. Now, if you're still with me, we have one small section, and most of this is review to go through, and I promise when you're done, we'll have tied this off into one nice bow. Let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention is going to be held with the goal of amending the Articles. What they realize when they sit down is that they are beyond repair. At this convention, we are in Philadelphia with 55 delegates from 12 states. This is a secret meeting because they wanted to avoid public scrutiny. The biggest concerns that these delegates are coming together to address are the relations of the states when it comes to commerce, the need for a strong central economy, economy, but authority, for diplomacy with other nations and the Native Americans, and to figure out how the heck are we going to repay all of our debt. When we look at the Constitutional Convention, it's oftentimes referred to as an assembly of demigods. Let's just flush this out. The oldest delegate is Benjamin Franklin at 81. The youngest is Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey at 26. We have Madison. We have Hamilton, we have Patrick Henry, we have Jefferson, we have Washington. Washington is embarrassed of his background because he's not as educated as some of the other members. Imagine Washington, who we look back on as this harrowing figure, is embarrassed when he stands in a room of these other delegates. That just shows you how absolutely outstanding these geniuses are. The average age was 43, but if we break down some of the characteristics, they're white males. They've all earned their wealth. We have one Roman Catholic. We have 30 of them who drafted their own state constitutions, 32 lawyers, 2 college presidents, 5 planters, 8 merchants or traders, 3 physicians. 25 of the 55 are going to own slaves, 6 former or current governors. 2 of the attendees would go on to be president, 1 would go on to be vice president, 4 would go on to serve in cabinet positions, 14 would be senators, 5 would be representatives, and the majority are fluent in Latin and Greek. If that's not an assembly of demigods, I don't know what is. And these geniuses are coming together to write our Constitution. When they're drafting the Constitution, the goal is to create a republic. Republics at the time were tiny or they had failed, but Madison is going to argue that the republic would be diverse and conflicting influences or interests would balance out and neutralize among the states. So a republic was the way to go. Republic being that we elect representatives from each state to represent the people. The issue Are the states going to surrender to a national power? Should we have a president? Should we eliminate the states altogether? These are questions that we don't really know the answer to at the time the Constitution is being written. But what they end up doing is creating a government to control the lust for power and safeguard individual liberty, which is all we really wanted there. Now, just to play a little devil's advocate here. The Beard's thesis has been an idea, and it says that the Constitution was created in an effort of conservatives to preserve the economic interest at the expense of the ideas or the principles of the Revolution, and not as an effort to preserve the ideals of the Revolution by eliminating disorder and contention. So, what the Beard thesis says is that decisions were made in the best interest of the writers who would directly benefit from the creation of a new government, that it was done strictly for personal reasons, that majority of the people could not vote for ratification because of the property requirements, and the people who needed help couldn't actually decide if the Constitution would be good, bad, or in between. So there is that negative view on the creation of the Constitution being Beard thesis that these assembly of demigods were really only thinking of themselves, that they created a Constitution that would directly benefit them and not the small man, which was what the revolution was fought for, the average person. But the average person couldn't vote at this time, so really it didn't matter if their opinion was different. Beard thesis. It's incredibly interesting to read about. If you want some more information on it, shoot me an email and I'll give you some. If we remember from our first unit, there are some ideas that need to be compromised on. We're going to have some rival plans when it comes to the Constitution. The first being the Virginia Plan, also known as the Large State Plan, proposed by Madison. This is going to say that the Republic part of the Constitution, where we are electing members to represent the people, should be based on population, that there should be a bicameral legislature, and it should all be population, the large state plan. Think about it, and we'll talk about this on Wednesday, but do you think that is fair, basing on population? And maybe if you don't think it's fair, you are in favor of the other plan, which was the New Jersey Plan, proposed by William Patterson, also known as the Small State Plan, where we would have a unicameral legislature, which is just a one house, and that it would be equally based. Everybody would have equal representation. One people, one vote, one nation united. That's the idea behind the New Jersey Plan. And which one of those do you think is fair? Bring your opinions to Wednesday's class. At the end of the day, the Constitution is known as a bundle of compromises, beginning with the Great Compromise, which is put together by Roger Sherman and John Dickinson, and it literally just puts a compromise together of the large state versus the small state. We get the bicameral legislature, which gives us the two houses in Congress, one being the Senate based on equality from the small state plan, and one being the House of Representatives based on population for the large state plan. But when we come down to this compromise, we run into one problem with the population, which is then solved by another compromise. If you remember again from the first unit, just a little bit more review, the 3/5 compromise, the South is going to say that their slaves should count towards the population. The North is going to say they should not count, because if they did, the South would have more representation, which means more power in the House of Representatives, which means the South would have control effectively of one whole half of Congress. So between the North and the South, we come together in the middle with the 3/5 compromise that says 3 out of every 5 enslaved people, or in the Constitution it says non-free people, because the word slavery isn't exactly mentioned, but we all know what they were talking about. 3 out of 5 would count for the population, and there's a stipulation of a congressional block when it comes to the slave trade. Congress couldn't touch it for 20 years. Again, we see that the issue of slavery and the seeds of the abolition movement are here. It's just not a fight we're ready to have at the beginning of our nation. And fugitive slave laws are put into place to hopefully protect from runaway slaves for those plantation owners in the South. When we look at federal power, this is another piece that we really had to come together on and figure out the best way that the people's needs would be met. The federal veto, there was supposed to be a federal veto over state laws, but Madison, who proposed that plan, actually abandons it, saying that it would give the federal government too much power. Instead, think about it this way, they just say that there is a federal supremacy with the supremacy clause over state laws. So while there isn't a veto to state laws, there is a supremacy idea there. The state's coinage of money, that had to stop because the states couldn't keep inflating the money supply. So instead, we create a universal money supply, and that way it also prevents debtors' relief being granted by each state. We have federalism, which is that division of power between the state and the federal government. Remember, we have delegated powers, those are given to the federal government, reserved powers provided to the states, concurrent, happening at the same time, implied, which is the elastic clause there, finding more powers to the Constitution than necessary sometimes, and denied powers, those specifically denied by the federal government. Remember, the elastic clause is going to be used sparingly by the strict constructionists who say that you read the Constitution word for word, and it will be used generously by the loose constructionist who say that you can kind of stretch the wording to find some reading between the lines and provide more power to the federal government. At the end of the day, though, the idea of limited government, the principle of limited government, is included in the Constitution, one that we have quite a bit of reverence for because of the revolution that we had fought so hard for. We create a government that is limited to a degree to provide success for our nation moving forward. I want to end with looking back on your weekly outline. Make sure you do your readings. Make sure both of your assignments, Journal 7, and your Constitution as a Counter-Revolution questions are submitted by Friday at 11:59. And if you are interested in that extra credit opportunity, please complete it by Friday at 11:59 as well. Any questions? Let me know.